3rd of April, 2021, here in Anderson, Indiana. And I always do that every time that I speak because there is another Anderson, and that's in South Carolina. So I always mention Anderson, Indiana. You may think, well, does that guy really know where he is? Well, yeah, I do, but I always mention that so that people are on the right place and the right station with us this morning. But we're glad you're here. Of course, this in the world today is a special weekend with Easter. Good Friday was yesterday. The Easter celebration is tomorrow. And we know from what the Bible tells us where Jesus was on this day. Not necessarily this day, but on the Sabbath, he was resting in the tomb. And that all comes in play with what we're going to talk about today. And I have talked about this many times over the last couple of years, in particular, because it is a big issue in the world today and in Christianity and in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. It's a big issue, and what I'm referring to is creation. And we're going to talk more about that this morning, but before we get into that, let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father, which art in heaven, we thank you this morning for the opportunity to come together. We pray now that our hearts and minds will be open to the things that we discuss this morning and share about creation. You are the Creator, the great Creator, not a God of stone or wood, but a God of humanity. A God who has emotions, a God who has feelings, and we in turn have feelings for thee. We pray that our hearts and minds will be open this morning, and those that are present here and those that are watching online today, we pray that their hearts can be open as they listen to the message presented from the Scriptures this morning, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. There is so much to share with you this morning. I'm glad all of you are here. We're going to be reading from the Scriptures as we always do. We're going to be sharing some things from a book, 2 books. First book I want to share from is a book called Education. Book Education. When I was in college, that was a book that I took a whole semester and studied it. That was the class. That was the textbook. There wasn't any other textbooks. It was just that book. And it was called the Book Education, written by a lady by the name of Ellen White. And I want to share with you a couple of pages from there this morning. I'm not going to necessarily read it verbatim, but I do want to share something with you. It's on page 128 and 129 out of this book called Education. This is not a real big book. It's 300 and some pages. But as I said, when you majored to be a teacher back in those days in the Seventh-day Adventist system, one of the classes that you were required to take to be a school teacher was the book Education. And that's where I took it, read it, and quite a few things underlined in this book. Right here on page 128, it says, since the book of nature and the book of Revelation bear the impress of the same mastermind, they cannot but speak in harmony. By different methods and in different languages, they witness to the same great truths. Science is ever discovering new wonders, but she brings from her research nothing that, rightly understood, conflicts with divine revelation. The book of nature and the written word shed light upon each other. They make us acquainted with God by teaching us something of the laws through which he works. It goes on to say that when you look at millions of years, it is claimed, were required for the evolution of the earth from chaos. Now, I want you to think about all these things this morning that I'm going to share with you. Notice what this one said. Millions of years, it is claimed, were required for the evolution, got that word, evolution, of the earth from chaos. Think those words through, evolution, chaos, in order to accommodate the Bible to this supposed revelation of science. The days of creation are assumed to have been vast, indefinite periods covering thousands or even millions of years. Now that may sound very strange to many of you here this morning, or even out here on the internet today. But brothers and sisters, this is something that is growing. It's been around for years and years, and it is growing within our Christian circle. That it took millions and millions of years to create this earth. Contrary to what we're going to read here in just a little bit from the book of Genesis. You see, there's people today who are calling themselves Christians who have embraced this theory. They have embraced the fact that the first 10, 11, 12 chapters of the book of Genesis is a myth. Now, I want keep thinking about that. If you go down that road thinking that the first 12 chapters of the book of Genesis is a myth, what does it do to the rest of the 65 books of the Bible? Yeah. I'll never forget, there was a fellow who came when I used to teach down south. He was a minister. They used to invite the different ministers in, to talk to the kids so they could understand what other denominations believed. And he was a very prominent man in this particular town back in the 70s. And that's what he believed. He told the kids that. And the kids just kind of sat there. Teenagers, and we were all teenagers once upon a time, we question a lot of things. And we may not necessarily demonstrate certain smartness as teenagers, but there is one thing that we do as teenagers, and that is dissect what people say very closely and think about it. And they dissected that one. I remember that very well. Such a conclusion is wholly uncalled for. The Bible record is in harmony with itself and with the teaching of nature. Of the first day employed in the work of creation is given the record. The evening and the morning were the first day. That's Genesis 1:5. That's 5 verses into the Bible. It's not something that comes out in chapter 10, 11, 12, chapter 20 of Genesis. That's within that first chapter. It's verse 5. It tells us what that is. And do you know what people come along and say, those in the science field? Because the title of this chapter is entitled Science in the Bible. You know what the people in science come along and say? That can't be. That just can't be. In one day? And the same in substance is said of each of the first 6 days of creation week. Each of these periods, inspiration declares to have been a day consisting of evening and morning, like every other day since that time. In regard to the work of creation itself, the divine testimony is, He spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. That's Psalms 33:9. with him who could thus call into existence unnumbered worlds. How long a time would be required for the evolution of this earth from chaos? In order to account for his works, must we do violence to his word? It's true that remains found in the earth testify to the existence of man, animals, plants, much larger than any now known. These are regarded as proving the existence of vegetable and animal life prior to the time of the Mosaic record. Before the flood, the development of vegetable and animal life was immeasurably superior to that which has since been known. At the flood, the surface of the earth was broken up. Marked changes took place in the reformation of the earth's crust. Were preserved many evidences of the life previously existing. The vast forests buried in the earth at the time of the flood and since changed to coal and formed the existence of coal fields and yield the supplies of oil that ministers to our comfort and convenience today. Jennifer?
In relation to what you first said about that it could happen in one day, 24 hours, and this was created, 24 hours, and that was created, and God just spoke it into being. I think of, and this is a little morbid, a little negative, but our lives can be changed in a second, just by a word. It's not that surprising. When the bombs were dropped during World War II, somebody spoke a word, and within seconds, cities were wiped out. Entire lives were changed. Our whole world was changed. We suddenly knew we had a power before unleashed. One morning I woke up. I was having a good morning. A few hours later, I had lost my son. And, you know, many of us can relate to things happening that literally changed the world. How many of us remember where we were when the planes crashed into the towers? I remember exactly where I was. And so the world can change very quickly, and to think that God's power is limited is silly. But I also heard this week someone say, I don't believe in science. And I thought they're just trying to be opposite. They're just trying to, and I think we can believe in both. When you were talking about the coal fields, and then we have oil. We too can create, we too can destroy, but it's unreasonable to think that we limit the power. God's power is much greater. So to think that he can create in one day is not a huge leap. No greater of a leap than to think that evolution happened over millions of years.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Joanne?
Well, I'll never forget, as a teenager, I went to high school and I learned about evolution. I was so excited, I could hardly wait to go home and tell my folks something they didn't know. And so I went home that night. We were sitting at the supper table, I'll never forget. And I started telling my folks about evolution and how it took all these years and blah, blah, blah. And all my dad had to say was, well, Joanne, all you have to do is either believe in God and the Bible or evolution. And that did it for me because I naturally believed in the Bible. So, but teenagers are so impressionable. And it's so sad when we go to some of these public colleges. I went later in life to get my nursing. Some of the things they taught amazed me. And anyway, I believed in the Bible.
Thank you. You know, people tell us as Christians, boy, you sure do have a lot of faith to believe that a God just spoke this and then it happened. And I look at those people and I think, you know, you must have a lot of faith to believe what you do that we came from an amoeba and a mollusk or a monkey and all of that. I mean, you think about that. That's quite a thing to think in those terms. Well, I'll tell you, I have so many things to share with you today. I hope that you have this book. It's called The Patriarchs and Prophets. There's a series of books. We call it the Conflict of Ages series. There's 5 of them. And it's about the history of this world. And this book here, Patriarchs and Prophets, when I used to teach school, I required my students to buy a copy of this book. And for the first 2 weeks, all we did was work out of this book. I had a textbook, but I threw it to the side. And we took the first 10 chapters and went through these 10 chapters. And if you want to know, and if you want to be better educated about the world history, I would strongly suggest that you take this book, and if you have children, grandchildren, you get a copy of this book and you give it to them and ask them to read the first 10 chapters at least. Because if you want a foundation for studying world history, this is where you go to get that foundation right here. The first chapter of this book is entitled, Why Was Sin Permitted? Now, that wasn't the reading for today. The reading for today was, there was 3 chapters in this book called the creation, the temptation and the fall, and redemption. Those are chapters 2, 3, and 4 out of this book, which is very important to understand the study of world history. It's very important to understand those chapters. Now, I can't read all of this material, but I do want to highlight some things here. Men are so intent upon excluding God from the sovereignty of the universe that they degrade man and defraud him of the dignity of his origin. He who set the starry worlds on high and tinted with delicate skill the flowers of the field, who filled the earth and the heavens with the wonders of his power, when he came to crown his glorious work and to place one in the midst to stand as ruler of the fair earth, did not fail to create a being worthy of the hand that gave him life. It goes on. His mind was capable of comprehending divine things. See, it's talking about man was to bear God's image. His affections were pure. His appetites and passions were under the control of reason. He was holy and happy in bearing the image of God and in perfect obedience to his will. It goes on. Adam's height was much greater than that of men who now inhabit the earth. Eve was somewhat less in stature, yet her form was noble and full of beauty. We're talking about perfect beings. We're talking about perfection in looks and so forth. We're talking about beings that did not have diseases, did not have any of these things that we're afflicted with today. We're talking about a man who is estimated to have been 14 foot tall and a woman who was about 12 foot in height. We're talking about people who would commune directly with God. They would walk in the Garden of Eden with God. They would commune and communicate directly with him. It goes on to say that God himself gave Adam a companion. And it says here, a part of man, bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh. She was his second self, showing the close union and the affectionate attachment that should exist in this relation. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it. That's Ephesians 5:29. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one. It was the work of Adam and Eve to train the branches of the vine to form bowers, thus making for themselves a dwelling from living trees covered with foliage and fruit. Now, can you imagine that's your job? Train the bowers, train the branches, that's another word for branches, so that this was your dwelling. Now, keep in mind also, folks, as you think about the Garden of Eden, It was a perfect place. It was a place that it did not rain. It was the perfect temperature. You know, in the summertime when it gets hot, we like to have the perfect temperature inside the house with the air conditioning, 72, 74, and that's what I've always, this is my own supposition, that I've always thought about the Garden of Eden. It was just like that perfect air conditioning year round. There were no seasons. Nothing was dying. There was no snow flying. And there probably, Brent, was not a bunch of wind blowing like we put up with around here lately. This was a perfect place. Perfect place. God created man in his own image. It goes on to say there were fragrant flowers. Now, can you imagine this? We know we have flowers today, and they're going to be coming out here as things warm up this week, and we smell them. We say, oh, that's wonderful. That's beautiful. Can you imagine the smell of those flowers in the Garden of Eden? What they must have smelled like. In the midst of the garden stood the tree of life, surpassing in glory all other trees. Its fruit appeared like apples of gold and silver, and had the power to perpetuate life. Creation was now complete. The heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. It goes on to say, God placed man under law as an indispensable condition of his very existence. He was a subject of the divine government, and there can be no government without law. There can be no government without law. Now remember, just a while ago I talked about evolution, and another word I used with evolution was what? Chaos. Well, chaos sure isn't anything about government. You can see that happening today in the world. Turn on the television and you can see what I'm talking about. Hundreds of people are dying by the day over in Southeast Asia. When you go on here, and it says, without freedom of choice, his obedience would not have been voluntary, but it would have been forced. Because people will say, well, why did he allow those people to behave that way? Why did he not just make them listen to everything I say? It would have been, he might have withheld the hand of Adam from touching the forbidden fruit, but in that case, man would have been not a free moral agent, but a mere automation. Without freedom of choice, his obedience would not have been voluntary, but forced. There could have been no development of character. Such a course would have been contrary to God's plan in dealing with the inhabitants of other worlds. True happiness is found not in the indulgence of pride and luxury, but in communion with God through his created works. And it goes on. The temptation in the fall, chapter 3. It says the angels warned them to be on their guard against the devices of Satan. Now, who did the angels warn? Adam and Eve. Now remember, Adam and Eve had communion with God. Adam and Eve they saw God. They walked with God. While they were obedient to God, the evil one could not harm them. For if need be, and get this, and this is still available to all of us in this room and on the internet today, what I'm about to read. It says, while they were obedient to God, the evil one could not harm them. For if need be, every angel in heaven would be sent to their help. That's a lot of help. Because we don't even know how many that is. We have no idea. Every angel in heaven would be sent to their help if they steadfastly repelled his first insinuations. They would be as secure as the heavenly messengers. But should they once yield to temptation, their nature would become so deprived that in themselves they would have no power and no disposition to resist Satan. no power, and no disposition to resist Satan. You think about that today, where we are, 2021. 2021 years after Jesus walked on this earth. Now, we may think this morning as we're sitting here, well, hey, I don't do this, I don't do that, I don't do, have our list. But folks, because of this, what happened almost 6,000 years ago, maybe a little over 6,000 years now, what I just read to you, they yielded to temptation. Their nature became so depraved that in themselves, that's us today, they would have no power and no disposition to resist Satan. We have to call upon Jesus to help resist these temptations that we have today. And that same promise that I just read to you, and I've mentioned this to us before, is that if need be, every angel in heaven would be sent to our help. But notice, the key here is we have to do what? We have to ask. We have to ask and realize that I don't have the power inside of me to resist these temptations. I have to ask. I have to be willing to humble myself to ask for that help. It goes on to talk about the serpent. It had wings, and while flying through the air, presented an appearance of dazzling brightness, having the color and the brilliancy of burnished gold. Re-stung in the rich laden branches of the forbidden tree and regaling itself with the delicious fruit, it was an object to arrest the attention and delight the eye of the beholder. Thus, in the garden of peace lurked the destroyer, watching for his prey. We're not talking about the way you see a serpent today, sliming around on the ground. This was really something to see. It goes on to say here, many talk of the narrowness of those who obey God's commandments, while they themselves claim to have broader ideas and to enjoy greater liberty. What is this but an echo of the voice from Eden in the day you eat thereof? Transgress the divine requirement, ye shall be as gods. Satan claimed to have received great good by eating of the forbidden fruit, but he did not let it appear that by transgression he had become an outcast from heaven. Didn't tell her that, did he? Nope. Though he had found sin to result in infinite loss, he concealed his own misery in order to draw others into the same position. You know the old saying, misery loves company. We know that one, don't we? Misery loves company. Yeah. So now the transgressor seeks to disguise his true character. He may claim to be holy, but his exalted profession only makes him the more dangerous as a deceiver. He is on the side of Satan, trampling upon the law of God and leading others to do the same to their eternal ruin. Well, it goes on to say, Eve really believed the words of Satan, but her belief did not save her from the penalty of sin. She disbelieved the words of God, and this was what led to her fall. In the judgment, men will not be condemned because they conscientiously believed a lie, but because they did not believe the truth. Because they neglected the opportunity of learning what is truth. They neglected the opportunity to learn what is truth. It goes on to say the serpent plucked the fruit of the forbidden tree. Now think about that. The serpent plucked the fruit of the forbidden tree and placed it in the hands of the half-reluctant Eve. Placed it in the hands of the half-reluctant Eve. Then he reminded her of her own words that God had forbidden them to touch it. Well, here she's got it now. It's in your hand. You've touched it, lest you should die. Now, I've always thought about this. Did they even understand what that word meant? I mean, you're living in paradise. Where nothing dies. So, I mean, I don't, and I used to teach my students this. They didn't know what that meant. Didn't know what that D-I-E meant. It wasn't in their vocabulary. It goes on to say, as she took the fruit, perceiving no evil results from what she had done, she grew bolder. And when she saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, grateful to the taste. And without a fear she plucked and ate, and now having herself transgressed, she became the agent of Satan in working the ruin of her husband. You see, when you study this and you read this, Eve was deceived. And now she took the fruit back to her husband. He had a choice to make. It's not deception now with him. And he made the choice to eat the fruit. And of course, as you know, what happened next? God came looking for them. And they were hiding. And remember, as the story goes, as you read it in Genesis, they said we were hiding because we're naked. We didn't have that light. Well, who told you didn't have the light? Notice he asks a question. He already knows the answer. Yeah. Investigative judgment. He already knows. And then, of course, we start the game. The game that's still being played 6,000 years later. Hadn't changed. The rules haven't changed. You know, it's not like some board games. You know, you might start playing a board game this year, and maybe 5 years from now, the rules to the board game change. This game hasn't changed any. And I'm talking about the blame game. Why in the world did you make... You made this woman. You created her. She brought this fruit to me. And away we go. We start the blame. Back and forth. It's still going on today. Still going on today. And sad to say, probably much more today. Because people, well, it's not my fault I fell. It was your fault that I fell down those stairs. What do you mean it's my fault? Well, it's your stairs. It doesn't matter if I was intoxicated. It's your stairs. You built that staircase. And that's why I fell down. You know, the blame game goes on. Well, things change quickly. And if you notice, something had to happen very quickly. And what took place was that tree, remember that tree in the middle of the garden? That tree would what? For life. What did it do for life? Eternal life. You eat of that tree, perpetual life exists. So a plan had to go in real quick. And that plan was angels were sent down there immediately to keep them away from that tree. They couldn't get to that tree. And shortly after that, we know from the Bible, they were asked to leave the Garden of Eden. And then there was an angel put outside the Garden of Eden to protect it. I always thought about that too, what that must have been like, because that would exist for some 1,500 years. The Garden of Eden would be on the earth. It would be taken up before the flood, but it would be there. People would see that. The antediluvian people, they would see it. Adam would tell stories to his children, great-grandchildren, great. I mean, the man lived 930 some years. There was a lot of people. And can you imagine what he must have put up with? Well, what are you talking about? God? I'm not saying all of them, because there were righteous people, but there were a lot of unrighteous. Because it got to the point, if you recall in the scriptures, that evil was what upon men's hearts? Continually on their hearts. Now, we live in a pretty bad world today. But you think about that. Evil continually upon man's hearts. You've got something I want, I'm going to take it. Could be your wife, could be your goal, because remember, they didn't have to drill mines to find gold. It was just out there. What a thing to think about. Well, there was a plan of redemption. And they were not left without hope. And of course, when you look at, I have to read this to you on this chapter 3, the last page. As they witnessed drooping flower and falling leaf, the first signs of decay, Adam and his companion mourned more deeply than men now mourn over their dead. The death of the frail, delicate flowers was indeed a cause of sorrow, but when the goodly trees cast off their leaves, the scene brought vividly to mind the stern fact that death is the portion of every living thing. Every living thing would die. Can you imagine living in a perfect place as they lived, and then death would come? What it would look like. Chapter 4 talks about the plan of redemption. That plan of redemption is available to all of us today. That plan of redemption is available no matter what you've done, where you've been, what has happened. The opportunity to call us, have angels come down and help us, it's available to all of us today. We have the same choice that Adam and Eve had. Same choice. We have an opportunity to call, and he listens, and he sends help. And it's so very important to not forget that in relationship to the plan of redemption. And it was something that I'm sure Eve must have thought that the Redeemer would be born while she was on this earth. It didn't happen. It wouldn't happen for many, many years. And Christ would come as the Redeemer for us today. I hope that has set some background for you for our study for this quarter. Because you'll notice the study for this quarter, the title of it, is The Promise. And it says, God's everlasting covenant. Now, we've talked about a covenant before. A covenant, another name for that is what? Contract. And when we talk about a contract or a covenant, there are terms to any contract that we make. There are two institutions that have been under attack that came out of the Garden of Eden. They've been under attack for thousands of years, and they're still under attack today. Two institutions. The two institutions that I'm talking about is the Sabbath and marriage. Those are the two institutions I'm referring to. The Sabbath, it's under attack today. Because, you know, in relationship to knowing the truth, as I mentioned before, we have to be willing to want to know the truth, which comes from within inside us and the Holy Spirit speaking to us to find out what is the truth. You see, we still have a choice, just like Eve had a choice and Adam have a choice. We still have that choice today, folks. We can want to know more and know the truth, or we can go on and listen to man talk about how we came from this chaos through evolution, and look how great and smart we are today. You know, it tells us, if you read in Patriarchs and Prophets, that Adam would commune with the plants. I can see the man was so intelligent that he could see the workings of those plants. You know, today we have to put things under a microscope, you know, the leaves and all these different things, and then we can see things through the microscope. Can you imagine having the ability to see those things with your eyes? Can you imagine being able to use your brain to the utmost? You know, it tells us today we use about 10%. About 10%. What's the other 90% doing? Well, he was going full force at 100. Can you imagine? On page 6, it says, "Then God said, let us make mankind," or humankind, "in our image according to our likeness." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. That's Genesis 1:26 and 27 is what that says. It is one, if you look at that paragraph, the biblical account of the creation of humanity is one filled with hope, happiness, and perfection. Each day of creation ended with a divine pronouncement that it was good. Certainly, that didn't include typhoons, earthquakes, famine, and diseases. And it goes on to say what happened, and notice what he said at the end of the sixth day. Did you catch that in the next paragraph? What did he say at the end of the sixth day? It was very good. Exactly. It wasn't just good, it was very good. And you'll notice on the next page, page 7, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It doesn't say evolution. It doesn't say Big Bang Theory. It doesn't say, we came from apes. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I guess the reason why I keep underscoring that is that if you have a discussion with somebody and that person says, I don't believe in God, don't believe in God at all, have no belief system whatsoever, it's going to be very difficult and hard for us to get to the next step. Because they've already made up their mind. God doesn't exist. Well, right here, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It tells us that. It's right there. It goes on to say, and here's where I want some involvement from you folks. Phil, if you would, turn to Psalms 100, verse 3. Trish, Isaiah 40:28, and we studied this one last quarter, Isaiah 40. And Joanne, Acts 17:26, please. And Ron, Ephesians 3:9. And Dennis, Hebrews 1, verse 2 and verse 10. Verse 2 and verse 10, Dennis, on chapter 1 of Hebrews. Now, it says here, it says, how does each one in its own way answer some of the above questions? What is the one point that they all have in common? What is the one point that they all have in common? Phil, you want to lead off, please? And you are doing Psalms 100, verse 3. Step back, please, Phil. Microphone.
I almost adjusted the video, but I didn't do much for the thing, did I?
No.
Can we start all over again? Psalms 100, verse 3. Know that the Lord is God. He is the one who made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture.
We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. And notice he said, who created us? It wasn't man. Notice it said that. Go ahead, Trish.
Isaiah 40, verse 28. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable.
Doesn't become weary and tired. Ends of the earth. Acts 17:26, Joanne.
And he is made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. And as a nurse, I can attribute to that because when we give blood to someone, we don't say, well, this came from someone who was of Asian descent. This came, it's all one blood.
It's all one blood. Thank you. That's very good. Very good observation. Ron, next one, please. Ephesians 3, verse 9.
And to make all men see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the world hath been hidden in God, who created all things by Jesus Christ.
God created all things. Dennis, finish it up with Hebrews chapter 1, verses 2 and 10.
This is for those out there who wonder if there's other people living on other worlds. Verse 2, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds. That's with an S.
Plural.
Yes. And verse 10, and thou, Lord, in the beginning hast laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the works of thine hands.
The heavens are the works of thy hands. All of these verses, again, point to who made the heavens and the earth. And that's important because it starts off in verse 1. God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There's no one else involved in this process. And these texts also affirm what verse 1 says. There is nothing about Charles Darwin. There is nothing about monkeys and apes and all of this. There's nothing about mollusks, amoebas, nothing about any of that there. Tells you right there who made the heavens and the earth. It says. Well, let's look at the next page, page 8. In page 8, it talks about in the image of the Maker. And it goes on to say, there are several things here. It says, Bible states that God created humankind, male and female, in his own image. That's Genesis 1:27. And it says here, use this idea to answer the following questions. What does it mean that God created us in his own image? In what ways are we in his own image? What ways are we in his own image? We look like him. Anyone else, make your way to the microphone and share your thoughts in relationship to what ways we are in his own image. Go ahead, Brent.
Well, Jesse, I'd like to say, unfortunately, we used to be a lot more in his image. You know, when God said, I made man in my image, that meant that we were upright, that we only thought of good things, that our character was pure, that we had the ability to think and to what would please God, and to create things that were beautiful in his eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Because he said we made him in his image, because that's who God is. He's love and he's beauty and perfection. And he made us in his image to be perfect, because he made us. At one time we were perfect. And he made us to be lovely and to think beautiful things and to carry out his will. So we were in his image. Now that image is like you've made things, and I have that, oh, that's a mess. It's all twisted up now. And that's the way we are now. And we're still, there's some form of that image, but it's a twisted mess. And he says, I'm going to recreate you and straighten that out.
Yeah, thank you. Recreate. Recreate. Yep, very, very true. It goes on to say, what else sets the race apart from anything else the Lord has created? Talking about the account of creation of humankind. Well, let me ask you this. We know God created everything. It goes through and tells us that in Genesis 1. Let me ask you this. You believe that he created the birds, fowls of the air, created the animals like bears, lions, and tigers? What's the difference between them and us? We can talk. We can reason. We have what? Power of choice, free will. Very true. We have dominion, and that's an interesting word there that you just used, and that's in the Bible. I think that's Genesis 1, 27, 28, somewhere in there, about having dominion over the animals. Yeah, Juan, go ahead.
Well, I think a good argument that we are the more like God in the creation is the fact that Jesus, the image of God, came to this world and was one like us.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a powerful testimony that we were created like God.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you. You know, somebody mentioned that they can't talk. Now go back to the account there in the Garden of Eden. The serpent talked, right? The serpent was talking to her, right? And you know, sometimes we might be kind of hard on Eve. And we might think today, well, why in the world were you talking to a serpent? Did you ever stop and think that maybe we do some similar things? I'm not telling you that, I'm not saying anybody in here goes out and talks to a snake. But maybe we're doing some similar things with temptation. Maybe trying to flirt with it a little bit. Say it can't really hurt me. Who's going to know? Who's going to see me doing such and such? Ron?
I said, God will see you.
God will see you. Yeah? He will. God will see us. Joanna?
I don't want to monopolize, but it says in my Bible, in Genesis 2, it says he caused, I lost my place. Oh, he caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam. He slept and he took one of his ribs. Have you ever counted your ribs, Jesse?
No.
Have you ever counted your wife's ribs?
No.
You probably should.
I should. Yeah. He took one of those ribs, yeah? Well, it goes on here. And on page 9, it says, God and humankind together. Sue, if you would, please turn to Genesis 1, and I'd like for you to read verse 28 and 29. Genesis 1, 28 and 29.
Then God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, See, I have given you every herb that yields seed, which is on the face of all the earth, and every tree whose fruit yields seed. To you it shall be for food.
Now, think about this. These two verses that she just read, as you follow along on page 9, it tells us about how God views the material world. Do they imply that there is something bad in material things and our enjoyment of them? What lessons can we learn from these early scenes in human history about how we should relate to the creation itself? All right, go ahead, please.
Well, I want to just say one thing here to think about is a lot of people use that. I'm supposed to have dominion over the earth. I'm going to dig that up, and I'm going to get that stuff out of there, and I'm going to sell it because I'm supposed to use the earth for my benefit, man's benefit, and make what I can out of it. And I got dominion over this. So that term is used a lot. But again, you started out by saying we were made in God's image. Now, how did God create the earth? He said, I want to make it perfect. I want to make it for your benefit. I want to make everything work together just right, and I want you to be able to enjoy it forever. So if he gave us, mankind, dominion over the earth, we would be thinking, I want to make this earth perfect for the birds. I want to keep it perfect for the animals. I want to keep the water flowing perfectly clean. I wouldn't want to have dominion in a way that would harm what God has made perfect and given to me. So I got to think, how would I utilize the resources and still utilize them, but keep them perfect in God's image? How would I do that? And that's where that word dominion has gotten all twisted, like we have through sin, in how we apply that to think, well, I'm just going to use it up, instead of I'm going to use it so that it's naturally refreshing, as God has made the earth to constantly replenish itself for our benefit.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a very good point in relationship to dominion and what that means. If we take the very selfish attitude towards these things and we say, well, I've got to get this, this, and this, what happens to the earth then years from now? And we're seeing the results of this in our world today, right now, where dominion has been stretched to the limit in relationship to what it means to them. been stretched. And so, when you look at this, you have to look at it from the standpoint of, as Brent mentioned, being able to sustain ourselves. And when we take, there is a price to pay. And we're paying that price in some parts of the world today. There are some parts of the world today that the fish life is basically dead. You go down to the mouth of the Mississippi River, and if you take an aerial shot of the mouth of the Mississippi, the algae and so forth for miles, as you can see in those pictures, it's dead because of all the chemicals and nitrates that have flowed down the Mississippi River for the last 150 years through fertilizers and so forth. And I'm not saying that you cannot fertilize. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the way that things have been taken care of could be greatly improved in how we take care of this earth. When you look on the next page, page 10, it says, at the tree. And I've already read some of these things to you at the tree. It says, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. When you think about that and you look at the second paragraph, it says, everything preceding in this chapter has paved the way for this climax. Talking about chapter 2. The future of the race centers upon this single prohibition. Man is not to be confused by a multiplicity of issues. I mean, we got all kinds of issues today out there that you can get wrapped up in. You can sit and watch CNN all day long, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I mean, you want to talk about issues? There's all kinds of them. You can watch them there. Well, Adam wasn't faced with this. Only one divine ordinance must be kept in mind. Only one. By thus limiting the number of injunctions to one, Yahweh gives tokens of his mercy. Think about that. Gives tokens of his mercy. Besides, to indicate that this one commandment is not grievous, the Lord sets it against the background of a broad permission. From every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. Only one. By calling Adam and Eve to obey his will, God was saying, I am your creator, and I have made you in my image. Your life is sustained by me, for by me you live and move and have your being. I have provided all things for your well-being and happiness, your subsistence, your home, your human companionship, and have established you as ruler of this world under me. If you are willing to affirm this relationship with me because you love me, then I will be your God and you will be my children. And you can affirm this relationship with the trust implicit in it by simply obeying the specific command. Now right there, that's a covenant, folks. That's a contract. You got two parties involved with this. You've got what the requirements are and what's going to happen if you do it. It's all there. It's all laid out for you. That's what a covenant's all about. That's what our relationship or our study is going to be this quarter. And in ending here on page 11, it says breaking the relationship. And it goes to Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. And then, of course, it ends our study there with Genesis 3:15 here on Thursday's lesson. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. That is the words of hope and promise that God made. That is the first promise in the Bible. Genesis 3:15, it's there, it's starred. If you have a Bible with promises and they starred, that's the first one that you find as a promise. So what we have is the relationship, the covenant was broken, but there is a promise now of the plan of redemption. And if you have the book Patriarchs and Prophets, read that chapter, chapter 4, the plan of redemption. Read it to help you understand better where we are in our study this time. Next week, we'll continue our study on the promise, God's everlasting covenant. And I appreciate all of you being here this morning. At this time, Brent will share with us